She concealed her true identity, the Alpha King, realized too late she was his destined queen. The announcement was already on the wall when Mara turned the corner with her morning tea, and she read every word of it from 20 feet away, before the small crowd pressing against the stone beside the post office had finished the second line. She had eyes like that, sharper than people would have guessed from looking at her, sharper than she ever allowed anyone to discover, because letting people find the precise things about you was how you ended up in conversations you had never planned to have, and in conversations you had not planned. The wrong detail, from the wrong person, at the wrong moment, could end a life like hers, in ways that could not be undone. Alpha King Kalen Dravith, 6 days, Ashvale. She turned around and walked back toward her shop, before she had made any deliberate decision to do so. Her body understood the situation faster than her mind was prepared to fully acknowledge it. She kept her pace even. She nodded to the woman from the bread stall as they crossed each other on the corner. She did not hurry. Hurrying drew notice, and notice was the one thing she had spent 6 years carefully and consistently training herself out of attracting. After enough repetition, the calm became less a performance, and more a physical state, like a posture held so long, it became the resting position. She was grateful for it right now, because underneath the calm, her heart was doing something she could feel all the way to the ends of her fingers. The shop was on the eastern lane, 2 streets removed from the main market road. She had chosen the location when she first came to Ashvale, with the same kind of deliberate care she had applied to every significant decision about her life here, which was to say with exactly as much thought as a person needed who was constructing a life specifically designed not to attract attention. Close enough to the market district to generate a reliable and consistent stream of customers, far enough from the main road that no one on any ordinary kind of business had any particular reason to look at it. The sign above the door was small and plain. Mara's Tailoring, painted in simple black letters on a board that had been weathered by 2 winters, and now looked as though it had been there considerably longer, which was exactly the impression she had wanted it to give from the beginning. The front window was narrow. The curtains were positioned carefully, light enough to work by, not transparent enough for a clear view from the street. Everything about the place said nothing interesting. This had not been accidental. Nothing about how she had built her life in Ashvale over the past 6 years was accidental. She unlocked the door, stepped inside, and sat down at her work table on the stool without taking off her coat, which was something she never did under ordinary circumstances, and which told her more clearly than anything else could have, exactly how thoroughly the morning had just rearranged itself. 6 days. She looked at the work table in front of her, the 3 order envelopes in their neat pile near the left window, the half-finished vest on the dress frame in the corner, the collar still awaiting its next round of pins, the row of thread spools on the left shelf, arranged by frequency of use rather than by color or by size, which was the kind of organization that arrived naturally, over years of actually using the tools, rather than from any deliberate system. It was the kind of detail that a person looking carefully at the room might notice and understand, as evidence of genuine occupation, of someone who had been here long enough that the room had organized itself around their actual habits. She pressed her left wrist flat against the work table without thinking about it. The sleeve was already pulled down to the edge of her palm, the way it was every morning, and every afternoon, and every moment that another person was within any reasonable distance. Beneath the fabric, on the soft inside of her wrist, was a crescent-shaped mark. It was small and pale, so pale it was almost silver in the right light, and it sat so close to the surface of the skin that in certain kinds of light, it appeared less like a birthmark and more like something her body had been making a quiet announcement about since the day she was born, continuously, and without pause, and entirely regardless of whether she wanted the announcement made. The mark was called the lunar seal. She had known what it was since she was young enough to need someone to explain it to her, and had understood the explanation well enough to feel the full weight of it from the moment it was clear. In all 5 wolf territories, the lunar seal appeared only on those born of the lunar bloodline, a lineage so old, it predated the current ruling families and the territorial borders that divided the packs and most of the laws and structures that governed pack life. The lunar bloodline had been regarded for centuries as something close to sacred, not a ruling line in the administrative or governmental sense, but something older and more fundamental than rulers, the root, in the understanding of the oldest traditions, from which the rest of the pack world had grown, something the territories were supposed to protect and honor, the way you protected and honored the oldest things. The previous Alpha King had not shared that understanding. He had held a different one, which treated sacred and protected as two words that sat uncomfortably close to dangerous and ungovernable when applied to a bloodline he could not control. He had acted on that understanding in the most complete way available to a man in his position. She pulled herself back from the edge of that thought, the way she always did. She had a rule about this, a deliberate limit on how far she let herself go into the history on any ordinary morning, because the history was a place she could get lost in for hours, and getting lost was something she could not afford. Not today, not any day really, but especially not today. She got up from the stool and went to the wooden chest under the back counter. She had carried this same chest through every room she had lived in for the past 6 years. Same chest, same lock, same contents organized in the same order, always positioned within easy reach of wherever she slept, always at a level of readiness that could be mobilized in the dark without light or searching. Inside it now, as always, a change of clothes, dark and practical enough for any weather or situation, a leather coin pouch with enough money to carry her through 2 full weeks of careful travel, with a margin for complications she had not anticipated, and a folded piece of paper that had been folded and unfolded so many times over so many years that its creases had gone soft and permanent, the paper feeling more like cloth now at the fold lines. She spread the map on the work table and looked at it in the cold morning light. She had drawn it herself 3 years into her time in Asheville, on a specific night when she had finally admitted to herself something she had been resisting admitting, which was that feeling, settled in a place, and being safe in a place, were 2 different conditions, and that if she confused them, she would eventually pay for the confusion. The map showed the back roads and the mountain passes, and the distances between towns in 3 adjacent territories, the hidden connective geography that a person traveling without official documentation could use to move without being noticed or recorded. She had updated it 4 months ago, when a passing merchant had described a northern mountain pass route in a conversation he had no reason to know she was filing away. At the time she had told herself it was simply good practice. You kept your options current. A map was a habit. She knew now, looking at it in the cold morning light, with a royal announcement fresh in her mind, exactly what the update had been. She refolded the map along its established creases and put it in her coat pocket. She stood for a moment with both hands on the edge of the counter and looked at the room. The shop, at this hour of the morning, was the most honest version of itself. No customers, no task underway, nothing requiring the management of a performance. Just the objects in it, and the light, and the silence. She had spent 6 years in rooms like this. Rooms that looked like nothing important was happening in them, while something very important was happening. She had become good at the dual occupancy of such spaces. The exterior of normalcy, while the interior ran its constant, watchful accounting. She thought about what it meant that she had lived in Asheville for 6 years. Not in 3 towns over 6 years. In one. This one. Longer than she had stayed anywhere since she left Valdenmoor. Long enough that the people here knew her face the way they knew their own. Long enough that the man at the grain market waved at her across the square without thinking about it. Long enough that Mr. Galt's visits had become a kind of standing appointment, and Petra's mother had started saving her extra thread on market days in case she needed it. Long enough for roots, or the near equivalent of them. Long enough for a green mug that fit her hand. She understood exactly what this meant. It meant she had done something she had promised herself. In the second town after Valdenmoor, she would never do again. She had let the place become something more than a shelter. She had let it become, by the slow accretion of ordinary days and small kindnesses, and the particular comfort of known patterns, something that resembled a life. She had been telling herself for 3 towns that what she was doing was staying alive. The truth was that she had been, without fully intending to, also trying to live, and the distinction between those 2 things was the exact shape of the choice that now stood in front of her. She put the needle down on the work table and looked at it for a moment. Then she picked it back up. Then she sat back down and picked up the vest and the needle and began working, because she had found over 6 years of this that her hands were better than her mind at managing a certain kind of fear. Her mind ran outward in all directions at once, following every possibility to its furthest endpoint, exhausting itself on futures that had not happened yet. Her hands knew only the stitch in front of them and the one after that, and the narrow focus of it was a specific kind of mercy. Her real name was Celine Auris Lunar. She had not spoken it aloud since the night she was 15 years old, standing in the cold dark outside the western gate of Valdenmoor, with nothing except the satchel Nora had pushed into her arms in the last possible moment, and the sound of her mother's voice still present in her chest, saying, "Say it when you are safe. Not before, only when you are truly safe." She had been waiting for that moment for 6 years. The shape of her life in those years suggested it was not arriving soon. She had been Mara for all 6 of them. Mara the seamstress, from somewhere east, no particular reason for the move, nothing interesting about what came before, and nothing interesting about her now. Mara was warm but measured. Mara's hands were skilled, but she never drew attention to the skill. Mara gave honest professional answers and careful personal non-answers, and the people of Ashvale had been the kind of people who understood without needing instruction that some arrivals came from somewhere they did not discuss, and that this was a privacy worth leaving alone. Mara had kept her alive and moving for 6 years. That was the one thing she could say about the name without any ambivalence at all. The morning passed, the way mornings passed, when she was working with half her attention, while the other half did something uncomfortable. Mr. Galt arrived to collect his repaired coat, and spent 20 devoted minutes examining the button replacement from every available angle, before pronouncing the work satisfactory, in the circuitous, thorough way that was his specific form of high praise. She gave him the warm patience she had developed for him over 2 years. He was a man in his 70s, who lived alone, and the sound of another voice responding to him was a form of company she had understood he valued from his first visit. Petra came in after him with a dress that needed alterations for a friend's wedding in 2 weeks, and Mara measured and marked and gave an honest opinion about the neckline that had not been requested but was clearly needed, and Petra left lighter than she had arrived. Between customers she swept the floor, reorganized the thread rack, reviewed the orders in their envelopes. She did all of it with the automatic ease of routine, while the other part of her attention ran the numbers. If she left tonight, she would clear the northern checkpoint before the royal convoy reached Ashvale, Fernbridge, in 4 days, at a pace unhurried enough to be unremarkable, large enough to absorb one quiet woman without producing a clear memory of her arrival. From Fernbridge the eastern coast in 10 more days, and the coastal territories operated on a sufficiently decentralized administrative structure that a person with a trade skill could exist there for years without appearing in any central record. The difficulty was not the calculation. The difficulty was 14 months of savings in this shop's lease. It was her needles, her mother's needles, the ones Nora had pressed into her hands at the western gate in the dark, in their case on the shelf. It was the garden she had started last spring that had produced the best onions she had ever tasted. It was the green mug she drank her morning tea from every day, found at a second-hand stall, nothing remarkable about it, except that it fit her hand with a rightness she had not expected, and had come to depend on without noticing she was depending on it. She was 21 years old, and she had been leaving behind small valued things since she was 15, and she was so deeply and thoroughly tired of it, that the tiredness had ceased being a temporary state, and had moved in as a permanent condition. She made her decision before the lamp was needed. She would stay. 6 days was manageable. The king's visit to any border delegation stop was brief, 2 days at most. She would keep the shop open, keep herself ordinary, manage 6 days carefully, and then the convoy would move north, and the danger would move with it. She believed this almost completely by the time she blew out the lamp. What she did not know was that Sergeant Roan had been in Ashvale for 2 full days already. He had ridden ahead of the main convoy the way he always did before a royal visit to unfamiliar territory. Plain clothes, no announcement, the pace of someone with nowhere particular to be. He moved through towns by listening more than looking, and he had spent 2 days in Ashvale listening carefully. By the end of the first day he had walked every street and spoken to more than 15 people and built a reliable picture of the place. Almost all of it was entirely straightforward. In the main tavern on the first evening, sitting at the corner table with a cup of tea and nothing particular on his face, he had listened to 2 hours of the comfortable open conversation that people had when they were confident no one important was nearby. He heard about the mill dispute. He heard about the blacksmith's new apprentice. He heard a dozen townspeople's names worked through several conversations with the easy familiarity of a community that had known itself for a long time. One name came through differently. A seamstress on the Eastern Lane. Mentioned in 3 separate conversations across the evening, and each time mentioned with a quality of subtle care that the other names did not carry. The instinctive, unconscious drawing together of a community, protecting someone they had come to value without formally meaning to. Not defensive, not secretive, just slightly more careful. Good at her work. Fair. Private. From somewhere east. Been here about 6 years. He noted it. He walked past the shop on his second morning. Small plain sign. Curtained window. Faint lamplight from within. He kept walking. That evening he held his pen over the blank space at the bottom of the standard report and sat with it for longer than usual. Then he put the pen down and sealed the report without writing anything additional, because he had a rule about what went into reports, and the rule was a good one, and he kept it. He would think about the rule later. He would keep thinking it was a good rule, while also wishing, in the small private way he allowed himself to wish things, that he had broken it just this once. In her shop that night, Mara lay in the dark with the map in her coat pocket, and the coin pouch on the table, and the sound of Ashvale going quiet around her. She thought about her mother's voice, which she allowed herself only in the deepest quiet. She pressed her sleeve down over her wrist. She told herself 6 days was manageable. The dream was the Iron Gates dream, the silver light that neither chased her nor released her. The road ahead that kept dividing into two no matter how fast she moved, the choice always arriving before she was ready for it. The king arrived on the morning of the 6th day, and Ashvale heard him before it saw him. Mara was at her work table when the sound reached her through the walls. Not the loose scatter of ordinary market-day horses moving wherever they wanted at their own pace. This was something deep and organized and deliberate, the layered sound of a large group of animals being directed by a single intention. She was mid-stitch on the second order of the week. She had been at the table since before the light was fully up, because the 5th night had been one of the ones where sleep stayed just out of reach long enough that she eventually stopped pursuing it and chose to do something useful with the hours instead. She kept her eyes on the needle. She had managed the 6 days with every unit of disciplined ordinariness she could produce. The shop stayed open every day, because closing it without a clear stated reason would have prompted the kind of neighbor concern she could not afford. She had repositioned the work table and stool so she could work without being visible from the lane outside, calibrated the curtains to the precise angle she had determined on the first morning after the announcement, and maintained that angle with complete consistency. She had declined 2 invitations to come watch the arrival, one from Graham the tool merchant who sent his youngest over verbally, one from Mr. Galt who had written a note of such formal politeness that she spent a brief genuine moment charmed by it before writing her equally polite refusal. Through the wall she heard the crowd noise building around the main square, the particular quality of collective excitement that arrived when something long anticipated became real. A herald's horn cut through it all briefly, high and clear, a crest of voices when the first horses came into view. Then the organized, settling business of a large formal convoy being received. Horses halted, bags moved, guards arranged to their positions. The machinery of a royal arrival working through its stages with the efficiency of something that had been done many times. She worked through all of it. She had 4 orders to complete before the delegation moved on. She moved through them with the part of her attention that lived in her hands and operated on knowledge that was laid down deep enough not to require conscious thought, while the rest of her maintained the watchfulness she had been running for 6 days, the steady, quiet monitoring of sounds and distances, and the specific qualities of the lane outside. At some point in the late morning, when the main square noise had settled into the lower, more routine register of delegation business, a sound from the lane made her look up. The delivery cart came down the eastern lane at the pace of a driver who had misjudged his load and was running behind schedule. She heard the momentum through the wall, the creak of something top-heavy and poorly balanced, and then the front wheel met the raised edge of the drainage channel at exactly the wrong angle, and the crash that followed was large enough and close enough that she was at the door before she had consciously decided to go to it. 6 years of belonging to a community produced instincts that operated below the level of deliberate thought. She went outside. The driver was already at his fallen load. 3 large bolts of fabric and a wooden crate of thread spools, the crate broken open on impact, spools rolling in several directions across the lane stones. She caught 2 before they reached the drain channel, pursued a third around the cartwheel, and was straightening up with both hands full when the quality of the air around her changed. Not a sound, not quite a sight. Something underneath both of those things. A shift in the weight of the moment. The specific alteration that happened when something arrived that carried a significance the ordinary air had not been built for. She had been 15, and running, and frightened, and it had hit her so hard she had stumbled mid-stride. She had not understood what it was at 15. She had understood it much later. She looked up. 4 people were coming into the lane from the direction of the main road. 3 wore the King's colors in the informal configuration of off-duty personal staff. The 4th wore a plain dark traveling coat with nothing on it to identify him. He was taller than the others and moved with a specific quality of attention, not in speed or direction, but in the awareness he gave the space around him. The carriage of someone for whom the environment had long since become something they moved through, while always being half prepared for whatever it might require. She knew who he was before she had a clear view of his face. She looked up. He looked at her. 3 seconds. The lane between them, her hands full of thread spools, his stride interrupted by exactly 1 beat, barely perceptible, the kind of thing only registered if you were watching specifically for it. And then the stride resumed, and the 4 of them passed the entrance to the lane and were gone. She helped the driver reload the cart. She said the right things about the drainage channel being a hazard the mayor's office had been ignoring for 2 full seasons. She went back inside and put the thread spools in their correct positions on the shelf, one by one, in order, from left to right. She stood at the work table. She was being sensible. Eye contact across a lane was not an event. Eyes moved and landed on faces throughout the day, without significance behind the landing. She was going to sit back down and pick up the needle and finish the second order. She sat. She picked up the needle. She put 3 stitches into the fabric and stopped. She sat with her hands in her lap and allowed herself, for exactly the time it required, to acknowledge what her body had been telling her since the moment on the lane. Then she picked the needle back up and kept working, because acknowledging something and acting on it were different things, and there was still work to do. In the upper room of the mayor's hall, Kalen Draveth stood at the window with his back to Sergeant Roan, who was going through the afternoon schedule in the organized, precise voice he used for briefings. The Farron Territory delegate's position on the trade revision, the most likely friction points in the meeting at the 3rd hour, the recommended positioning for the border allocation session the following morning. He was right about all of it, and Kalen was aware of him being right, and was also aware of not being able to focus on the specific content of what he was saying, which was unusual enough to be something he noted internally. 7 years ago, standing alone in the Valdenmoor courtyard on a night in early winter, something had arrived with such completeness and without any warning that he had lost his breath. A sensation of direction and connection, and something he had no accurate word for, not a metaphorical description, an actual felt experience of orientation, of something pointing. It had dissolved before he could trace it to a source. He had stood in the empty courtyard for a long time afterward in the cold and had not spoken of it to anyone, because the only language available for it was the language of very old stories, and he was not a man who lived in old stories. He governed 5 territories and signed death penalties, and managed trade disputes between people who hated each other. He did not live in old stories. 7 years of silence since then. 7 years of declining the lists his advisors compiled. With a quiet firmness, they had eventually accepted as a permanent feature, rather than a temporary position. He had given no explanation for the declines. He had simply declined, year after year, until it became a settled fact about him. On the eastern lane that morning, for 3 seconds, an echo of the courtyard had come back. Not the full force of it. Something quieter, older, like hearing a single note of a piece of music you had only heard complete once, and knowing the whole piece from that one note, with a certainty that could not be argued with. He had recognized it the moment it arrived. There was no question in it. "Roan," he said. "Sir." "The woman in the eastern lane. The cart that went over." A brief pause. Roan registering that he had noted the incident, and deciding how to respond to being asked about it directly. "I saw it as we passed. Find out who she is." "Of course, sir." The sensation in the courtyard had not repeated. He had waited for it, not obviously, not in a way he would have been willing to name as waiting, but in the 7 years since, he had stood in rooms where something like it might have appeared, and it had not appeared, and he had sat in quiet spaces, where the conditions seemed as close as he could arrange to those of the courtyard, and nothing had come. The lists his advisors compiled were full of women who were by any reasonable standard good choices, intelligent, capable, from families whose alignment would benefit the territories, with the specific qualities that made someone a good partner in the complicated work of governing. He had looked at each list with the attention it deserved. He had felt, looking at each list, exactly nothing that resembled what he had felt in the courtyard, and he had declined each list with the same quiet firmness, without explanation, because there was no explanation he could give that would not have sounded like a man who had lost his reason in a courtyard one night and was now refusing to accept substitutes for a ghost. He was 28 years old, and he governed 5 territories, and he signed his name to laws that shaped the daily life of more people than he could count. And he was also, when he was being honest with himself in the specific private way that required no audience, the man from the courtyard, still carrying what the courtyard had given him, still waiting for what it had pointed toward. On the eastern lane, for 3 seconds, the pointing had happened again. He was not imagining it. He had asked himself, in the afternoon following the incident, whether he was allowing the want of something to create the impression of having found it. He had asked himself this with the same rigor he applied to everything, and reached the same conclusion. No, what he had felt on the lane was what he had felt. Not the full force of the courtyard, faint, older, the way something heard at a distance was recognizable without being complete, but from the same source. He had recognized it the moment it arrived, and there was no question in the recognition. He had also recognized, standing in the mayor's hall with the afternoon light coming through the window, that this was the beginning of a situation that required management rather than impulse, and that the first management required was his own. He went to the briefing table. He opened the Farron file and read it with the full organized attention he could apply to nearly anything when he committed to applying it. He absorbed every relevant detail and identified the likely friction points and formulated his preliminary positions. He did all of this completely and properly. Roan's report came by early evening. Seamstress on the Eastern Lane, 6 years in Ashevale. No family. No birth record traceable from the Eastern registries under the name given. Neighbors described her consistently. Skilled, fair-priced, private, warm in small practical ways, from somewhere east. He read it twice. He folded it and put it in his coat pocket. The following morning, he walked the Eastern Lane alone, in plain clothes. Without Roan, without notice. He moved at the pace of someone going nowhere in particular. He found the shop door open, a woman inside, speaking to a customer who had her back to the door. He watched her hands as she spoke. The specific ease of someone whose knowledge lived in the body rather than in the process of remembering. Her sleeve had ridden up on one arm from working. At a certain angle, for a fraction of a moment, he thought he saw something on her inner wrist. Then the customer shifted, and the angle changed before he could be certain. He came back 20 minutes later and knocked. She opened the door. The change in her face lasted less than half a second and resolved into a stillness so expertly managed that most people would never have registered the change at all. He had spent his adult life reading faces under controlled conditions. He registered it precisely. She let him in without asking him to come in. She went to the far side of the work table and stood with her hands at her sides and looked at him and answered his questions with the ease of someone who had answered these specific questions, or close versions of them, many times before. From somewhere east, a small place. Her mother had taught her the trade. He asked what the place was called. Harrelton, she said. Immediately, without any visible searching for it. He noted the absence of searching. Real memories had a texture that practiced ones didn't have. He had spent years learning to read the difference. When she said her mother had taught her the trade, something in her voice changed for exactly one beat. Not broke, but shifted texture. The way a surface shifted when the material beneath it briefly showed through, and then it was level again. He stood and thanked her, and went to the door and paused once. Harrelton, he said. Yes, Your Majesty. He left. That evening, he asked Roan to check for Harrelton in the Eastern Territory records. Roan came back the following morning. There was no Harrelton. 2 quiet watchers on the Eastern Lane, Kalen said. I want to know if she makes any preparation to leave. Security concern, sir? Roan asked carefully. No, Kalen said. Roan held the particular look for the appropriate number of seconds. Discreetly, yes, sir. In her shop that night, Mara sat in the dark after the lamp was out and listened to 2 sets of footsteps maintaining a patient circuit on the Eastern Lane, the specific rhythm of a deliberate watch rather than a passing presence, organized, consistent, not going anywhere. She understood what they meant. She sat with that understanding for a long time. Then she took the map from her coat pocket and held it in the dark without unfolding it, because she had memorized every line on it and didn't need to look at it to see it. The moment for waiting had closed. The summons arrived the following morning, sealed in dark red wax, with the king's mark pressed exact into its center, and Mara sat with it in both hands for a long moment before she broke it open. The mark was precise. Crown above, crossed swords above a running wolf. The signature of the house she had spent 6 years and 3 towns orienting herself away from. It sat in her hands in her shop on the Eastern Lane in Ashvale, and had the particular quality of something that had been patient for a very long time, and had decided, somewhere in the past week, that its patience was finished. She broke the seal and read it. Formal language, completely unambiguous. King Kalan Dravith's delegation required the services of a skilled seamstress for the preparation of ceremonial garments for the Blood Covenant Summit at Valdenmoor. The services of Mara Ashton of Ashvale had been personally selected by the king. She was to present herself with tools and materials at the mayor's hall by the 2nd hour of the following morning. Transportation to Valdenmoor would be arranged and provided. The stated rate of pay was specific, and it was generous enough to tell her, without any ambiguity at all, that this summons was not primarily about the garments. There was no refusal clause. There was never a refusal clause in a royal summons, because the legal structure of the territories allowed no commoner to decline a direct royal request without a specific, documented, verifiable reason. She had none. She could attempt to fabricate one, but the verification process that would follow a refusal was precisely the kind of scrutiny she could not withstand, and she understood this clearly. She could still leave tonight. The map was in her coat pocket. The northern route was fully planned. She had thought through every step of it twice in the past week. But the watch on the Eastern Lane was organized. Roan was a professional who had been doing this for more than a decade. If she left tonight and was found on the northern road 10 miles from Ashvale, with a packed bag and no account of herself, the situation became significantly worse than the one she was currently managing. The summons gave her a reason to be on the road to Valdenmoor that anyone could verify. The pack on her back in the dark of a pre-dawn departure gave her nothing. And there was something else. Something she had been refusing to think about directly because thinking about it directly cost more than she was prepared to pay right now. Inside a large palace preparing for a major summit, there were moments. There were always moments in large organized operations, if you stayed organized and kept your eyes open and used the moments correctly when they appeared. She had survived 6 years by finding moments. She would find them here. She packed her tools that evening with the care of someone who had packed and unpacked their tools more times than the number of years they had been using them should have required. The needles first, her mother's needles, in their case, placed separately from everything else the way they always were. The good spools, the marking chalk and measuring tape and the flat tin of pins. One change of clothes, dark and practical for any weather. The coin pouch in the inner coat pocket where it couldn't be reached without reaching past her. The map in the outer pocket, familiar at her fingertips through years of handling. She presented herself at the mayor's hall at 1:45 hour, early enough to look professional, not so early as to look anxious. The journey to Valdenmoor took 3 days at the pace the convoy maintained. She rode in a supply wagon near the rear of the column, a position she had chosen herself when given the available options, and she sewed practice hems on a scrap of fabric she had brought specifically for this purpose, because her hands needed something to do, and the rhythm of the needle was the most reliable steadying mechanism she had found, in 6 years of needing things to be steady. The other people in the wagon were palace-bound staff on the return journey after the Ashvale stop, a cook's assistant named Blythe, who had strong and well-founded opinions about food, and expressed them without embarrassment, 2 housekeeping maids absorbed in their own ongoing conversation, a quiet man named Gareth, who maintained the guard horse's tack, and found 3 days on the road entirely unremarkable in the way of someone who had made this trip many times and had made peace with its length. They asked her the standard questions, and she gave them Mara, seamstress, somewhere east, and they moved on to their own concerns. She did not sleep well on either of the first 2 nights. On the second night she lay on the roadside inn's pallet and thought about Valdenmoor directly and without management, because she had found over years of this that looking at the difficult thing squarely cost less in the long run than the constant work of almost looking at it. She let herself think about the house in the old quarter where she had been born, The wide wooden floors, the high ceilings, the broad trees along the back garden wall, where the afternoon light came in at a particular angle she had thought, as a child, was specific to that house and nowhere else. Her mother tending the garden with a genuine and particular attention, each plant individually known. The smell of the soil after a heavy rain. Her mother's voice naming plant varieties in formal Latin, with an affection that made the precision feel like a private language between them, and not like classification at all. The third stair from the top of the main staircase, its specific creak, the exact placement of her foot to step over it when she came home after she was supposed to. All of it was gone. The floors and the garden and the stairs and the people inside, all of them. She thought about her mother and her father and her older brother who had been 17, and spending those last ordinary weeks teaching her a card game she never got good at, laughing generously every time she lost, because the game was genuinely secondary to him. She thought about the cousins who had arrived the week before for a visit and who had not gone home. She held all of them in her mind fully, without managing it, for the time it took to do so honestly. Then she put it back where she kept it and turned onto her side and lay still. She did not sleep, but the stillness was something, and sometimes something was what was available. On the second day of travel, the king's horse came level with the supply wagon for a stretch of road. She heard the change in the hoofbeat pattern, the slowing to match the wagon's pace, holding there for 4 full seconds, and then the horse moved ahead, and the sound of it returned to the larger pattern of the convoy. She put 3 more stitches in the practice hem without varying her pace. Valdenmoor appeared on the horizon on the morning of the third day, first as a dark mark against the pale winter sky, then as the shape of the city walls clarifying, then as the palace towers above everything else, exactly as tall and exactly as cold beautiful as she remembered them. Cities were like that. People left them, years accumulated, and the skyline looked at you across the distance, with the patience of something that had been there before you, and expected to be there after. She looked at it with the expression she had maintained for 3 days. Interested, professionally engaged, someone arriving somewhere new for a reasonable work reason. She did not look toward the old quarter when it came into view at the right side of the main approach road, though she could have identified it from twice this distance with her eyes closed. The palace received her with the organized indifference of a large institution that processed many people and did not personalize the experience. She was given a room in the servants' wing, small, clean, a single window over the back corridor, and then taken to the workroom prepared for her, a long table under 2 windows, adequate morning light, a rack for fabric bolts, 2 dress frames. Better than she had expected. She set down her bag. She placed her tools on the table in their order. She stood at the window and looked at the section of palace garden visible below. Bare winter trees along the back wall, hard pale ground, things that had been here before she left and would be here after she left again. She had been in rooms in this palace before, not this room, rooms on a different level, behind a different gate, in a different configuration of her life. She knew exactly where those rooms were, relative to where she was standing. She did not allow herself to think about the distance between them. She was placing her mother's needles in their line on the work table, one by one, in the order she used them, first and separately from everything else the way she always placed them, when footsteps stopped in the doorway behind her. The woman standing there was past 70, in dark, neat palace staff clothing, a book held under one arm. Her face was deeply lined with the lines that came from decades of expression rather than from sun or weather, a legibility that younger faces hadn't developed yet, a face that told you something about the quality of a long life if you paid attention to it. Her eyes were the clear, pale gray of someone whose sight had not dimmed with age, the way most things did, and they were doing something that made the back of Mara's neck go absolutely still, reading her with the quality of someone reading a document they already know the contents of, checking the specific language against a prior memory of it. "Can I help you?" Mara asked, in the warm professional tone she used for everyone. The woman looked for another long moment, at her face, at her hands, at something in the overall composition of her that Mara could not precisely identify. Then she said, very quietly, "No, I don't think you can." She turned and walked back down the corridor, without waiting for a response. Mara looked at the empty doorway. Then she picked up the next needle and placed it in its position. She completed the row. She spent the rest of the afternoon organizing the workroom with total, deliberate focus, and that night she checked the lock on her room door 3 times before she was able to put out the lamp. Edmund, the palace steward managing the summit preparation, brought the ceremonial garment specifications to the workroom on the first morning and stood back with the expression of someone who had learned to anticipate a substantial period of explanation and clarification. Mara read all 12 pages of the specifications without asking a single question. Then she said, "I'll need 12 more yards of the dark gray silk and 3 fresh spools of the weighted gold thread. What I've been given is the wrong weight for the specification, approximately 30% lighter than required." Edmund picked up the thread spool she held out to him. He consulted the weight notation in the specification document. He wrote in his notebook without further comment and left. The correct materials arrived within the hour. She started working. The specifications were technically demanding but navigable for someone with the right background, and she had that background completely. Absorbed in childhood at her mother's side in a different kind of workroom. So thoroughly and so early absorbed that the techniques required here felt less like deliberate recall and more like accessing something that had always been available and was simply being called upon now, after a long interval. Her hands moved through the work with the specific ease of genuine knowledge rather than of memory. She watched every piece carefully before she set it down. She was careful about everything, always. The days organized themselves around the rhythm of the work. She was in the workroom before the light was fully up, and usually still there, when the dinner tray had come and gone untouched. She moved through the palace only by the most direct routes between the workroom, her room, and nowhere else. She was warm and responsive to every staff member who came through. Edmund with his periodic check-ins, which were professional and efficient in a way she appreciated. The housekeeping maids who stopped in the doorway to watch her hands work. The junior stewards with materials and questions. She was pleasant without being memorable. She was open without giving anything away. She managed herself from the inside out, constantly, the way she had managed herself for 6 years. On the 4th day, King Kalen came to the workroom. She heard the footsteps stop in the doorway, while she was pinning the collar of the first completed ceremonial garment. She finished placing the pin. She turned. He came in and looked at the garment on the dress frame, at the organized table, at the arrangement of materials and tools, with the same comprehensive attention he gave everything. Nothing in the room appeared to fall below his threshold of notice, and the room understood this, and gave him everything. "The collar seam," he said. She looked at it herself. The specification requires the double-back weave at the seam margins for this grade of ceremonial garment. I followed the specification exactly. "It's a court technique," he said. "Old. Its specific origin is the tailoring tradition maintained by the lunar household for this palace for more than 2 centuries. It was used exclusively in garments prepared for the ruling house during that period." The silence that followed had a specific weight to it. The lamp on the table between them held steady. She had not thought about the pattern once while she was using it. The technique had come from her hands, the way anything learned young and thoroughly enough came. Not recalled each time, simply present and available, laid down in childhood through years of her mother's patient and repeated teaching, until it became automatic. She had used it across 4 days of work without registering it once, until he named its origin in a single sentence. "My mother taught me this pattern," she said. Both sentences were true. Neither one gave him anything he did not already have. He held her gaze for a moment. Then he looked back at the collar and examined it at length, with an attention that considerably exceeded casual interest. "It's good work," he said. He left. She stood very still for a moment, after the sound of his footsteps had faded from the corridor. Then she went to the work table and stood with both palms flat on its surface, and breathed in the slow, deliberate count of 4, until her heart returned to a pace she could think clearly around, rather than through. The pattern. She corrected it that afternoon, on every piece of work still in progress, substituting the nearest available alternative, close enough to satisfy the specification requirements, different enough to not name its specific historical source. The error was small enough to absorb. She had confirmed nothing, given him nothing he could act on directly, but it was one more thread of the wrong kind, accumulating in a picture she was watching with growing attention, and she needed to be more careful. Clara came to collect a tea tray 2 days after. Clara was a younger housekeeping maid, cheerful and genuinely curious, the kind of person who asked real questions and listened carefully to the answers, without any social performance around either the asking or the listening. She had been through the workroom twice before, and asked genuine questions about the stitching both times that Mara had answered with real information. Because people who asked genuine questions deserved genuine answers, and because being warm and professionally open with the palace staff was part of the quality of ordinary she was maintaining here. Clara reached for the tray handle near the door, caught the toe of her boot on the edge of the fabric runner laid across the floor near the entrance, and stumbled sideways with the specific sudden inevitability of someone whose balance was already gone before they could begin to correct for it. She grabbed the nearest stable thing, Mara's left arm, just above the wrist. The grip and the momentum together pulled the sleeve up 2 full inches before either of them had processed what was happening. The crescent mark was in the afternoon light from the window. 2 full seconds. Pale and clear and precisely what it was, silver pale, very close to the skin's surface, visible in the particular way of something that had never needed strong light to show itself clearly. Clara looked at it with the completely uncomplicated curiosity of someone who saw something that caught her eye, and was looking at it honestly. "Is that a tattoo? It's lovely." "Yes," Mara said, and pulled the sleeve down and smiled, and said the runner caught the foot that way every time, and someone really should pin that edge to the floor properly. Clara laughed and agreed, and picked up the tray, and went back out into the corridor. The moment the door was fully closed, Mara looked at the wall beside the window. From the corridor outside came the sound of footsteps, not Clara's light, receding tread. Those were already moving toward the stairs. Something heavier, already moving away from the direction of the workroom doorway, at a pace that was deliberate rather than passing through. The specific pace of something moving away from a position it had been holding, rather than simply walking somewhere. She sat down at the work table. She did not allow the complete thought about those footsteps to form. She picked up the next piece of work and began placing pins with the slow and focused precision of someone whose hands had a job that required their full attention, and she kept that precision going until the light from the window began to change with the afternoon, and the sound from the corridor had been gone long enough that she could stop monitoring for its return. That evening, a knock at her room door. She opened it and found Seraphine, the pale gray eyes, the book under the arm, the expression that had been reading her since the first time they had occupied the same doorway. Mara opened the door wider and stepped back without speaking. Seraphine came in. She took the chair near the window. She set the book on the table, opened it to the section near the back she had prepared, reviewed it briefly in silence, and closed it. She set it on the table between them. "I want to tell you what I know," she said. "Not as a negotiation, not to ask for anything in return, not to ask you to confirm or deny anything, simply because I believe you have been the sole keeper of the complete truth for long enough, and you should know that at least one other person holds it now." Mara leaned against the wall opposite the door. Her arms were crossed, not defensively but in the way of someone organizing herself to listen carefully. She said nothing. Seraphine began. 18 years ago, the lunar household had been removed from Valdenmoor. The word in the official record was removed, the passive construction that official violence had always preferred since the first time someone needed to put official violence in a record. The decree cited a structural threat to territorial stability. It had been signed by the old Alpha King and implemented within a single night, with the clean efficiency of something that had been planned carefully before it was formally authorized. Seraphine had been in the palace records room when it happened. She had heard the sounds from the direction of the old quarter, and gone to the window and stood there, and witnessed and remembered, because witnessing and remembering was the only action available to her at that moment. She had stood at that window for a long time. Then she went back to her desk and sat in the dark and listened to the palace settle into a silence that felt different from ordinary silence. In the months and years that followed, she had assembled the full picture from the small fragments of information that individually seemed to say very little, and together said everything. She had worked slowly, through the specific channels available to a palace historian whose position gave access without authority, and she had built the true record alongside the official one until she held them both. The lunar bloodline carried an inheritance that appeared only once per generation in recorded history. The oldest territorial texts called it the eternal bond. When a lunar-born individual completed the bond with their destined mate, what resulted was not a partnership in the ordinary sense of the word. The historical accounts from the 2 previous occurrences described something that operated at a level distinct from ordinary partnerships. A shared strength that belonged to the bond itself rather than to either person within it, a combined capacity exceeding what either carried alone. The first documented instance, 4 centuries ago, had produced the governance structures that still formed the foundational skeleton of the 5 territories. The second instance, 2 centuries after that, had ended an 11-year territorial war that 3 governing bodies and numerous separate negotiation efforts had been unable to conclude by any other means. The old Alpha King had read both accounts. He was a man who understood power, with the specific and unsentimental intelligence of someone who had spent his entire adult life acquiring it and protecting it. He had done the calculation that a man of his intelligence and his particular values would do. He had reached a conclusion that the intelligence had then been put entirely in service of. He was afraid, Seraphine said, not with heat, with the precision of someone who had held a fact for 18 years and decided that the most honest way to hold it was plainly, without embellishment or emotional elaboration. Not afraid of anything your family had done, not afraid of any act they had committed, or any threat they had made, or any intention they had expressed, afraid of their potential, afraid of what the bond would mean for the territorial balance if it was completed, afraid of a thing that had not happened, and had never been indicated to be happening, because the historical record of what it had done, when it had happened, was sufficient to frighten him. Mara was very still. The specific stillness that came from hearing something you already knew being said clearly by another voice for the first time. The removal was nearly complete, Seraphine continued. The primary family, the extended family, the household staff, all accounted for in the aftermath. The record noted one discrepancy. One juvenile member of the household could not be confirmed. The search ran for 3 days, and was then closed. She was not in the house that night, Mara said. The words came out before she had decided to say them, and she let them go. No, Seraphine said, she wasn't. A neighbor's child was unwell. The household healer had been called to attend. The girl had gone along as company, an ordinary arrangement of the kind that happened regularly, that meant nothing, that no one had planned around. A pause. A servant who had previously worked for the lunar household took her out through the western gate in a market cart. Late enough that the gate traffic was minimal, they were not stopped. The servant had been Nora. Mara kept the name entirely inside herself. I looked for years afterward, Seraphine said, through the channels available to me. I found nothing, and I eventually came to believe she had probably not survived. A pause with a specific, contained quality to it. I was wrong. Yes, Mara said. Seraphine looked at her for a long moment. One more thing, she said. About the current king. He was 12 years old when the decree was issued. He was told the lunar line had died out through natural causes, the slow and natural end of a bloodline that had run its course. He grew up with that as settled historical fact, as background rather than as a question. He had no means of knowing otherwise. She paused. What was done by his father. It was not done by him. I know that, Mara said, simply true, worth saying clearly between them. Seraphine left, taking the book. Mara sat alone in the workroom for a long time. She let herself think, fully and without managing it, about the people who had been in the house on the night she could not name by any name other than the night. Her mother, her father, her brother at 17, the cousins who had come to visit. She held all of them clearly in her mind for the time it took to do so honestly. Then she put it back where she kept it. She told Mara about the 2 previous instances of the eternal bond, in detail she had spent years assembling, from sources that were not easy to find, because the earliest sources had been written before the current territorial structure existed, and required significant cross-referencing to make sense in the context of the present. The first bond, 4 centuries ago, had occurred during a period of widespread territorial fragmentation. 7 separate pact territories of varying size and stability, with shifting alliances and frequent conflict over resources and borders. The lunar-born individual of that generation had been a woman named Aeva, and the historical record described the bond's completion as producing a shift in the quality of her authority, and her mate's authority, that was qualitatively different from anything either of them had possessed before. Not simply the addition of 2 sets of strength, something new, belonging to the bond itself, that neither of them carried separately. In the years that followed, the governance structures that now defined the 5 territories had been established, not by conquest or by political negotiation, but by a form of order that the historical sources described as arising naturally out of the presence of the bonded pair, as if the territories themselves had reorganized around the fact of the bond. The second bond, 2 centuries later, had occurred during the 11-year war between 3 territories that Seraphine had mentioned. That war had produced a casualty count that the historical records documented without emotional language, but that was, if you read the numbers carefully, staggering. The lunar-born individual of that generation had been a man named Orin. The war had ended within 1 year of the bond's completion. The historical sources from that period described the bonded pair not as military commanders who had defeated one side or the other, but as a presence whose authority the warring territories had simply accepted. A settled, unargued authority. The kind that did not require force because it was recognized as something more fundamental than force. Neither instance had involved the lunar-born individual taking the throne. Neither had involved any formal transfer of political power. What the bond produced, in both cases, was something the sources struggled to name precisely. One 4-century-old historian had used the phrase, order that is recognized, rather than order that is imposed. Another had written, in the old court language, the authority that lives in the nature of things, rather than in the will of people. These were not precise descriptions, but they pointed at something. What the old Alpha King had understood, reading these accounts, was that the bond produced a form of authority he could neither control nor predict, nor counter, with the forms of power he possessed and trusted. He had understood this correctly. What he had gotten wrong was the conclusion he drew from it. Seraphine also told her about the protections. The old council, 300 years ago, had established formal protections for the lunar bloodline, legal structures that placed the household under a specific category of territorial law that made interference with its members a matter of territorial record and consequence, rather than a private decision. These protections had been quietly removed from the law over a period of 12 years, during the reign of the old Alpha King's own father, before the current king's father had taken the throne. By the time the decree was issued, there was nothing in the legal structure of the territories to prevent it. Seraphine had found the record of the protections' removal. She had found the specific legal mechanism used, and the administrator who had processed the removals, and the date range over which they had been quietly accomplished. She had found all of this, and had kept it, for 18 years, alongside the record of the household itself. She told Mara all of this. She told it plainly, without embellishment, in the organized way of someone who had been carrying it for a long time, and knew exactly what it contained. When she finished, she looked at Mara for a long moment. The bond has not been completed in 200 years, she said. The current generation is the first since then to have both a lunar-born heir and a living destined mate. The next time either of those conditions will exist simultaneously cannot be calculated. She paused. What was nearly prevented 18 years ago was not a threat. It was the opportunity the territories have been waiting 2 centuries for, whether or not they know they have been waiting. She left. She picked up the nearest unfinished piece of work and began sewing. She thought about a 12-year-old boy given a tidy and settled version of history, growing up in it the way you grew up in any piece of your reality. The walls looking solid, because no one had ever given you the means to test them. She thought about the bond, felt twice now, both times pointing in the same direction without any ambiguity at all. She worked until the lamp needed trimming and kept working after it was trimmed, and when she finally went to bed she left her left wrist face up on the blanket without covering it, which she had not done in 6 years, and lay in the dark thinking about what it meant to have a decision arriving before you were fully ready for it, and whether readiness was something she was going to be allowed to wait for. The Blood Covenant Summit opened on a morning, cold enough that the breath of the delegates rose in visible clouds above the ceremonial table, even with all 6 of the great hall's hearths burning at full capacity, and Mara stood near the back wall in her plain working dress, holding a small sewing kit she had no expectation of needing, watching the most politically significant gathering in 7 years begin its formal opening. She had not planned to be in the hall. The workroom had been her plan, contained, bounded, occupied entirely by her own work, and available to her complete management. A junior steward had appeared at the early hour, with genuine apology in his posture, and the information that the senior seamstress was expected at the opening ceremony in case of last-minute garment requirements. She had looked at him and reached her conclusion in 3 seconds. Arguing with this instruction would produce more attention than simply attending. Edmund the steward was to her left. 2 other senior staff members were to her right. She held the sewing kit in both hands and kept her face in the expression she had calibrated for this setting. Attentive, professionally present, someone here for a practical reason, giving the ceremony appropriate respect. The expression of someone who had come to do a specific job and was doing it correctly. Not watchful, not measuring. She had located 3 exits on her first days of measurement work in this hall. The back left service alcove was the best option. It led to the service corridor behind the kitchen, and from there to the servants' stairwell. She kept this information organized in the part of her mind that stored critical information without displaying it. The hall was at full capacity. Every seat at the long ceremonial table held a territory delegate or their senior representative. The gallery above held observers and additional staff. The King's Guard stood at every entrance in the formal configuration that communicated to everyone in the room that what was happening here was being taken very seriously by the highest authority in the 5 territories. At the head of the table, on the chair fractionally taller than all the others, Kalen Dravith sat in the full formal gray and gold of his office. He had looked once at the back wall when she entered, a brief glance that registered her position and moved on, and had not looked that direction again. She noted the deliberateness of it. The ceremony moved through its formal stages, the herald's opening words, the invocation of territorial unity, the acknowledgement of precedence, the long procedural preamble that established for the record that all parties were present willingly and in full standing. Several of the delegates maintained this claim with visible effort. Edmund murmured names and territorial affiliations to her as each delegate rose to make their acknowledgement. She let him, without indicating she already knew every name and 3 years of associated political history. Then Elder Bodrick was guided to the center of the hall, and the quality of the room changed. Not loudly, not in any way that announced itself. The particular deepening of attention that happened when something entered a space that was genuinely the thing it appeared to be, rather than a performance of it. When the thing happening could not be managed or staged, and everyone in the room understood this simultaneously. Elder Bodrick was past 80. His 2 attendants guided him with the careful precision of people who had been doing this specific task for years and understood their role with complete clarity. He was brought to the center of the hall, and stood there and was still, and the hall was still around him, and he began. The reading of the ancient names had been part of the Blood Covenant Summit for 3 centuries. It predated most of the current territorial administration, predated the specific form the summit had taken for the past 100 years. He moved through the room in the slow arc his tradition required, naming bloodlines in the old language, unhurried and accurate. He worked without any pattern that corresponded to the seating arrangement or to any other visible organizing principle. He simply followed what the room showed him. Mara stood at the back wall and counted her own breathing and kept her face correctly arranged and did not let anything else be visible on it. The elder named a bloodline at the left section of the table. He named one near the center. He was working steadily through the hall, patient and thorough. He stopped. He had been mid-arc, working through the right side of the hall, and he simply stopped. His head turned, slowly, with the specific certainty of a compass finding its bearing, turned toward the back of the hall, toward the back wall, toward the small group of palace staff standing near the service alcove. His clouded eyes, which saw in a way that was not the ordinary way of seeing, settled on a direction that was, with complete clarity, hers. One attendant glanced at the other. Elder Bodrick drew breath. The silence in the hall was absolute. Every person present had stopped moving at the same moment, in the collective response of people who understood that what was about to happen was significant. From the front right section of the ceremonial table, Lord Aldrich Ferris, 2nd delegate of the Farron territory, rose from his chair. He rose the way someone rose when their body had made the decision for them before they could. Suddenly, involuntarily, with a sound that cut through the total silence before anyone had finished processing what was happening. His face had gone the specific gray of a physical emergency. He pitched forward toward the table edge. The 2 nearest guards were moving before the rest of the room had caught up. The delegate beside him grabbed his arm. A voice from somewhere near the center of the table called for a physician. Another guard crossed the floor from the right side at a rapid walk. The formal arrangement of the ceremony dissolved into the organized disorder of an emergency in a large formal setting. Delegates standing from their chairs, chairs scraping, voices overlapping, the collective attention of the room pulling urgently toward the right corner. The elder's attendants turned to him immediately. One took his arm and guided him toward a chair. The herald's voice cut through the noise, calling for order. Mara moved. She moved with the group of back-wall staff who were naturally pressing toward the sides of the hall as the center filled with the emergency response. Not faster than them, not with any different visible intention, simply moving with the natural flow of people getting out of the way of something urgent. She moved until she reached the back left service alcove. She stepped through it. Service corridor. The kitchen's back passage. The servant's stairwell. Her floor. She had her coat on before the thought of putting it on had fully formed. The coin pouch was already in the inner pocket. She had kept it there since the night of the footsteps on the eastern lane. She crossed to the work table and picked up the needle case. Her mother's needles, the ones Nora had pressed into her hands in the dark at the western gate without ceremony. These were your mother's, you'll want them. She put the case in the pocket beside the coin pouch and picked up her bag. A knock at the door, soft, unhurried. She stood very still for a moment. Then she opened the door. He was standing in the corridor. No guard escort, no formal attendance. Just Kalen Dravith, in the dark coat he had worn to the opening ceremony, standing outside her room with the expression that was the least readable she had seen from him yet, which she had come to understand was what his face did when the feeling behind it was significant enough that containing it was costing him something real. He looked at the bag in her hand. She looked at him. "Come inside," he said. Not an order, and not exactly a request. Somewhere precisely and deliberately between the two, and she noted the precision. She stepped back. He came in. He closed the door. The elder was about to name something, he said. The Farron delegate fell ill, she said. At a very specific moment, he looked at her steadily. What would he have named? The room was quiet. From somewhere in the depth of the palace below, the sounds of the hall reassembling itself around the interruption reached up through the building, muffled, distant, ordinary, belonging to another level. She said nothing. He waited. He inhabited silence the way he inhabited every space, without discomfort, without agenda, simply present in it and willing to stay. "Who are you?" he said. The practiced answer was already forming. She stopped it. "Someone who was not supposed to be found," she said. He was quiet. "Someone who came here because there was no legal way to refuse the summons," she said. "And who is asking you, respectfully, to let her leave tonight?" "Why tonight specifically?" "Because someone in that hall recognized me tonight." "Not from my face. I have been careful enough about my face for 6 years. But from what the elder was going to name, or from the garments, or from something that confirmed what they already suspected. That person sent a message this evening through a network, connected to your father's old administrative circle. If I am still in this palace by morning, the way they manage this situation will not be something I can argue or talk my way out of in a corridor." Something changed in his face. Fractionally, at the edges of his expression. "You're in danger. The kind that prefers to look like something else," she said. "Yes." He held her gaze. "Show me your wrist," he said. She felt the words before she had finished hearing them. "No," she said. "Then tomorrow comes regardless," he said. "And I cannot manage what I don't understand." She stood in the room with her coat on, and her bag at her feet, and her mother's needles in her pocket, and thought about 6 years, and what they had been for, and what they had cost, and about what it meant to be standing in this specific room, with this specific person, at this specific moment, and whether this was the end of the 6 years, or the beginning of something she had no name for yet. She pushed the sleeve up. The crescent mark was in the lamplight, pale and clear and exactly what it had always been, not performing anything, not apologizing for anything, simply present. He looked at it for a long time, long enough that the silence in the room acquired its own texture, not empty, but full of something she could not precisely measure. What she read in his face, watching carefully for the small remainder his training left visible, was not the face of a man encountering something new. It was the face of a man looking at confirmation of something that had been assembling itself without his permission for a very long time, and finding it exactly where and what he had understood it to be. "Sit down," he said. The same level voice, but the contained quality in it had changed, become something more direct and less managed. "Tell me what you're willing to tell me." She sat. He sat. She told him. The shape of her life for 6 years, and the reason for the shape. What she carried, and why it had been hidden. The bond. That she had felt it herself, twice, and what both moments had been like from her side of them. The first time at 15, at the western gate, running, hit so hard she stumbled in the dark. The second time on the eastern lane, fainter, older, still unmistakably from the same source. She did not tell him the specific things she had seen on the night she was 15, because those things were hers, and she was not yet ready to put them into another person's keeping. But she told him the structure of the truth, and it was more than she had told anyone, since Nora put her in the market cart and told her to face forward and keep going. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "One night," he said, "I need to look at some things and talk to Roan. I am asking you to still be here when I'm done." A pause. "I know I have no right to ask. I know the difference between asking and the other things that have been used against you. I am asking." She thought about the threat moving toward her through a channel she could not trace. She thought about the organized quality of the watch that had been on the eastern lane, and what it said about what was available here. She thought about the bond, felt twice now, both times pointing in the same direction, both times without any ambiguity. "One night," she said. He went to the door and paused at it the way he always paused at her doors. "Don't leave," he said. He left. She sat alone with her left wrist, face up on her knee. The crescent mark in the lamplight. Visible, not covered. She looked at it without hiding it for the first time in 6 years, and felt something she had not felt in a very long time, something at the edge of what she was willing to let herself feel, which was the specific and dangerous sensation of something she had kept entirely closed beginning, very carefully, and very tentatively, to open. She sat that way until the lamp burned lower. She thought about one more night and what it meant to grant it. Then she got up and checked the lock on the door, and lay down on the narrow bed, and looked at the ceiling, and did not sleep, but kept her wrist uncovered, and the mark was in the dark, like the pale small moon it was shaped to suggest, and she lay with it visible, until somewhere past the middle of the night. Kalen did not sleep. He left her room and went directly to the archive in the lower eastern wing, because there were things he needed to read before he was in any position to give Roan the right instructions. The private administrative orders from his father's reign were filed in a subsection under a 3-letter code he had known existed and had never opened. He opened it now. He read the orders from beginning to end. Then he read them a second time. There was nothing behind the reasons cited in the public decree. The decree named a structural threat to territorial stability, and the archive contained no documentation of that threat anywhere. No council vote, no independent assessment, no incident report, no intelligence summary, no evidence of any specific act or intention, or even expression of threat by the lunar household. Not one document. 2 advisors had signed confirmations, both written in the language of men who understood their role was to confirm what was already decided, rather than to advise on whether it should be decided. The orders had been issued and implemented with the specific clean efficiency of an action that had been planned carefully before it was formally authorized. He read the correspondence next, 18 months of letters from his father to the senior secretary, and in them, the arc of a fear building in a man who was powerful, and intelligent, and thoroughly afraid of one specific thing. Not afraid of anything the lunar household had done, not afraid of any act they had committed, or any threat they had made, or any intention they had expressed. Afraid of their potential, afraid of the bond, and of what the bond would mean for the territorial balance if it was completed. He had read the 2 historical accounts of the bond, the 4-century-old record of the first instance, and the 2-century-old record of the second, and he had done the calculation that a man of his specific intelligence and his specific values would do, and the calculation had led him to a conclusion, and then the intelligence had been put entirely in service of the conclusion. The result was a family. He read the closed notation at the end of the final implementation report. 1 juvenile member of the household unconfirmed. Search discontinued after 3 days. Notation closed. He set the last page down flat on the archive table and sat with his hands on the surface and was very still for a moment. Roan arrived with the materials he had requested. He sat them on the table and stood and looked at his king with the particular quality of attention he reserved for moments when the reading of the room told him that what was needed was not the briefing voice. There was no threat, Kalen said. His voice was completely level in the way that came from placing a very deliberate and very substantial distance between a feeling and the words above it. The decree names a structural threat to territorial stability, and there is no documentation for it in this archive. Not one document. My father signed the order because he was afraid of what the lunar bloodline might become if the bond completed. Not afraid of anything they had done. Their potential. He looked at the page in front of him, and the search for the one unaccounted member ran for 3 days, and was closed, because they assumed she was also gone. Roan said, very carefully, the assumption was not correct. The assumption was not correct, Kaelin said. She has been in Ashvale for 6 years, running since she was 15 years old. A silence. The Farron delegation's second attaché, Kaelin said. Full background, every documented connection to the old administrative circle, from my father's time, by morning, and Elder Bodrick is to be approached privately. I want to know whether he completed his reading before the interruption, and if he did, exactly what he noted. Roan confirmed and left. Kaelin went back to reading. He read everything in the archive about the lunar bloodline, 4 centuries of historical records, the 2 detailed accounts of the eternal bond, and what had followed each instance, the governance structures that had resulted from the first occurrence, the territorial peace that had followed the second. He read his father's personal papers from the full decade before the decree, and saw, in the long sequence of them, the shape of a man who was intelligent and capable, and who had been putting that intelligence and capability entirely in service of a fear, rather than in service of anything honest. It was not an irrational fear. That was the thing that made it complicated. The fear had a basis in the historical record. The bond had reshaped the territories twice. A man who valued control of those territories might genuinely fear a third reshaping. The fear was understandable. What was done with it was not. The windows showed the first gray light of dawn before he stopped. He put on his coat and went upstairs. The room was neat. The bed had been used and carefully straightened. Her tools were gone from the work table. The bag was gone from the corner where she had set it. On the table, one small piece of paper. He crossed the room and picked it up. 4 words in her handwriting. I know. Thank you. He stood with it for a moment. Then he folded it carefully and put it in his coat pocket beside the Harrelton report, and the 2 pieces of paper sat together in the same pocket, and he pressed his hand flat against them once. He went to Roan and gave 3 instructions in 5 minutes. The Farron's second attaché was to be detained quietly under summit security protocol. No public announcement, no formal charge until the full picture was clear. Elder Bodrick was to be approached privately that morning, and 2 groups of 4 riders were to leave Valdenmoor within the hour, one taking the northern road, one the western. She is a guest of the crown, he said, and his voice was completely steady. When she is found, she is to be told so directly. She is not to be frightened or pressured or managed. She is not to be treated as a suspect or a threat. She is to be told that I am asking her, specifically asking, not directing, to come back. Roan confirmed and organized and left. The summit continued for 3 days after that. He ran it. He sat at the head of the ceremonial table and conducted the territorial business with exactly the precision and contained authority that 9 years of leadership had made characteristic. He was fully present in every meeting. He signed what needed to be signed and directed what needed to be directed, and managed the specific complications the Farron situation had introduced into the summit's political balance with the organized efficiency he brought to complicated problems. And he waited. The Farron attaché confessed on the first day of quiet questioning, with the thoroughness and the relative speed of a man who was more afraid of what was behind him than of what was in front of him. He had recognized the stitching pattern on the ceremonial garments on his second day in the palace. He had confirmed the identification through a pretext visit to the workroom. He had sent a message through the old network, the remnant of the administrative circle from the previous king's time, still functional after 18 years, still organized enough to act on information of this specific kind. He did not know who received the message at the other end. He had simply sent it, because that was the procedure when you encountered information of this kind, and he had been part of the network long enough that following the procedure was automatic. Kaelin read the confession. He set it face down on the table without commenting on it. Elder Bodrick confirmed, in private with Roan, that he had completed his reading of the hall before the interruption. His arc had finished before the delegate rose from his chair, though the completion had not been publicly announced before the emergency intervened. He had noted the lunar seal at the back of the hall, in the group of palace staff. He said it was the clearest reading he had encountered in 40 years of practice. He said it sat in the back of the room, like a star that someone had brought inside and left there without announcing it. The report from the riders came on the evening of the third day. Roan brought it in with a particular quality in his voice, the voice he used when something had genuinely surprised him, which was not a quality he had occasion to use frequently. She had been found at a village called Harrow, on the Devon River, 2 territories from Valdenmoor, at the riverside inn there, at an outdoor table, in plain view. She had arrived 2 days before. She had given the inn owner her real name. Kalen was still for a long moment. He thought about the outdoor table, and the plain view, and the real name. He thought about what those 3 things together meant when chosen by a woman who had spent 6 years being invisible. It was not carelessness. It was not breakdown. It was a decision. The specific decision of someone who had stopped running and was waiting for what came next, on her own terms, rather than in the middle of a road at night. "Tell the riders to stand down," he said. "I'll go myself." He was on the road within the hour. The road to Harrow was 3 days at a convoy's pace, and 2.5 at the pace of a man with 2 quiet companions, and a clear direction, and nothing ceremonially required of him. He rode it in 2.5. The winter countryside was gray and still and honest in the particular way of things that were not trying to be anything other than what they were. He had time to think, and he used it. He thought about what he had read in the archive, about his father, whom he had known as a capable and organized man, revealed by 18 months of private correspondence, to also be a man of a specific and driving fear that had eventually been indistinguishable from the intelligence he was feared to understand. He thought about what it meant to have a capable mind put entirely in service of a fear rather than in service of anything honest. The results of that combination were in the archive, in the closed notation, in a girl running at 15 through the western gate of Valdenmoor, with nothing except what a servant could press into her arms in the last possible moment. He thought about the 12-year-old boy who had been given a neat and settled version of that history, and who had grown up in it the way you grew up in any piece of your reality. The walls solid, the floor reliable, nothing in the experience of standing inside it suggesting the walls needed examination. He thought about what it cost to test walls you had been standing inside for 20 years. He thought about the bond, the courtyard at 21, and the overwhelming arrival of it, the most complete thing he had ever felt, dissolving before he could trace it. The eastern lane 7 years later and the 3 seconds of echo, faint, older, unmistakably from the same source. The workroom where she pushed the sleeve up and the lamplight found the pale crescent mark, and he understood, looking at it, that the understanding had been assembling itself in him for a long time, and was simply now complete. He rode toward Harrow. He had 2.5 days, and he used them to arrive fully, rather than just physically. The village of Harrow sat at the place where the eastern road met the Devon River, and briefly became somewhere, rather than simply a road between places. It had been exactly this size for as long as its records went back, and it had the settled quality of a place that had made a quiet decision about what it was going to be, and had been keeping that decision comfortably for a very long time. Kalen arrived in the mid-morning, with 2 companions who stayed with the horses as he crossed the terrace. He could see the inn from the road. He could see the outdoor terrace at its front. He could see the table nearest the river's edge, and at it, a woman in a dark coat sat with both hands wrapped around a cup, looking at the water, with the stillness of someone who had made a decision and was waiting for what came next, with the patience of someone accustomed to waiting. She looked up when she heard the horses. He dismounted, crossed the terrace, and sat down across from her without being invited. He was going to examine this habit at some point, when there was less pressing business in front of him. She looked at him. He looked at her. The outdoor table between them, the gray winter river beyond, the cold, pale morning light that showed everything clearly and promised nothing warm. No trappings here of their respective positions, no formal context, no staging. Simply 2 people at a table in a small village on a gray river that had been quietly watching things happen on its banks for 200 years. He did not speak for a full minute. He sat with his hands on the table and let himself arrive at this moment completely, before he tried to say anything about it. Some moments required that. "The Farron attaché is in custody," he said. He confessed in full on the first day of questioning. He recognized the stitching pattern and confirmed the identification and sent the message through the old network. The network is being traced and dismantled. The specific danger that sent you out of Valdenmoor is being addressed. He paused. You are not in immediate danger. All right, she said. Her voice was level. Elder Bodrick completed his reading before the interruption, he said. He told Rowan privately what he had noted when he turned toward the back of the hall. He paused. He said the lunar seal was the clearest signal he had encountered in 40 years of practice. He said it sat at the back of the room, like a star, that someone had brought inside and left there. She looked at the river. The water moved over its winter stones with the quiet patience of something that had been doing this for a very long time and had no concept of urgency. He looked at his hands on the table. I read the archive, he said. Everything from the relevant period, the public decree, and all the documentation behind it that was not included in the summary I received when I took the throne at 19. The internal orders. My father's private correspondence for 18 months before the decree. He stopped for a moment. Then he said it directly, because this was the moment that required directness. There was no threat. The decree names a structural threat to territorial stability, and there is no documentation for that threat anywhere in that archive. Not one supporting document of any kind. My father signed the order because he was afraid of what the lunar bloodline might become if the bond completed. Not afraid of anything your family had done. Afraid of their potential. He held her eyes. I want you to hear that said to you plainly. By the person who now holds the throne that signed the order. Even though that person was 12 years old when the order was issued, and was given a lie for a history, and had no means of seeing through it. She was very still. Not the trained still of concealment, a different quality of still. The kind that came from hearing something you already knew being said clearly by another voice for the first time. The record has a closed notation, he continued. One juvenile member of the household unconfirmed. Search discontinued after 3 days. Notation closed. He paused. They assumed. They were wrong, she said, quiet and precise. They were wrong, he said. That error ran forward for 6 years into your life, and backward for 7 years into mine, and I cannot undo either of those things. I am not going to tell you that I can. The river moved. Upstream, a bird kept its single, clean, repeated note, with the patient indifference of something that had no concept of the weight of what was happening on the bank below it. The decree will be formally recanted, he said. The territorial record will be corrected in full. The lunar bloodline will be officially restored. The household will be documented accurately and completely. These actions will happen regardless of anything else in this conversation, because they are simply the correct actions to take, and they do not depend on your agreement or your response. They depend on the truth, which I have now read in my own archive. She looked at him. What do you want? She said. The same question she had asked in the palace room, on the night that felt, from this side of 2.5 days of road, like it had happened in another version of the world. He had not had the full answer then. He had it now. I want to proceed from ground I have actually tested, he said. I have been standing on ground, prepared for me by someone else's decision, for 28 years. The walls looked solid, and the floor looked reliable, because I had no means of knowing otherwise, and no one gave me the means. I have the means now. I have used them. I am not going back to standing on untested ground. He held her eyes steadily. And I want to stop pretending that what I felt on the Eastern Lane is something I can manage by choosing not to think about it. She was quiet. She looked at the table. Then she looked back at him. I am not going to use the bond as leverage, he said. I am not going to describe the territorial implications of your bloodline's restoration, or what the political reconfiguration might require, or any of the things that are large and real, and will need addressing at some point. All of those things are true. They are not what I am saying right now. He paused. Right now, I am asking you to come back to Valdenmoor. Why? She said. Because what was broken deserves to be properly addressed, he said. Because you have spent 6 years as someone who doesn't exist, and I have spent 7 years declining lists I couldn't explain, and I think both of those things have gone on long enough. She was quiet for a long time, long enough that a bird upstream finished one sequence of its note and began another, long enough that the light shifted fractionally as the winter sun moved without warmth through its low pale arc. I'm not agreeing to anything specific, she said. I know. The record. and the decree happen regardless of anything I do. Yes, they will. I will not be arranged into anything, she said. Not politically, not for the summit, not for the bond or the history, or the balance of the territories, or any of the things that are older and larger than both of us. What I agree to is what I agree to, and what I don't is what I don't, and neither of those are things you get to decide for me. Yes, he said, that is correct, and I am not asking to decide them. I am asking you to come back. What you decide when you're there is yours to decide. She looked at the river for a long time. Then she looked at him again, and what he saw in her face was something he had not seen there in any of their previous encounters. Not the trained calm, not the professional ordinary, not any of the careful surfaces she had maintained. Something older than all of those things, and more tired, and more honest. The specific expression that appeared when a person had been carrying something very heavy for a very long time, and was deciding whether to keep carrying it in the same way, or to do something different with it. I need to know that when I go back, I am going because I chose to, she said, not because of sealed letters and no legal refusal available, and men watching Elaine at night, not because of the bond, or the history, or any of the things that are external to me, and pulling in a direction. She met his eyes, because I decided, my decision, on my own terms, for reasons that are mine. He looked at her. Yes, he said, that is exactly what I am asking for. Your actual decision, not your compliance, not your cooperation under any kind of obligation or pressure. Your decision. He paused, and I am telling you one more time, because it matters that it is said clearly between us. The decree and the record do not depend on this decision. They will happen. What this decision is about is whether you come back. That is the only thing it is about. She was quiet. He did not fill the quiet. He sat in it with her, and let it be whatever it needed to be, and did not move it with urgency. She put the cup down on the table. She stood. She pulled her sleeve down over her left wrist. The motion was completely automatic. 6 years of it. So deeply established that it happened before she was aware of reaching for it. She looked down at the covered wrist. She stood very still for a moment, and then, slowly, with the specific deliberateness of a decision made and enacted in the same breath, she pushed the sleeve back up. The crescent mark was in the pale winter light. Visible. Clear. Exactly what it had always been. Not performing anything. Not apologizing for anything. Simply present the way a thing was present when it stopped being hidden. Not at him. At the mark itself. At the crescent shape on the inside of her wrist that she had covered every day for 6 years, with the automatic protection of someone who had learned very early what visibility cost. The needles in my coat pocket were my mother's, she said. Nora gave them to me at the western gate in the dark. I have carried them for 6 years, and I am not leaving them behind again. You don't have to leave anything behind, he said. She walked toward the horses at the edge of the terrace. He stood and followed, falling in beside her at exactly the pace she set without adjusting it, and neither of them spoke for a while, and neither of them needed to. The river ran quietly over its winter stones. The bird upstream kept its single patient note. The light over the terrace was the pale, unhurried light of a winter morning that made no promises and showed everything exactly as it stood, not warm, not soft, not trying to be anything other than honest. She had spent 6 years becoming very good at leaving. She was walking toward the horses. The crescent mark was visible on her wrist where the sleeve was pushed back, and the winter air was cold against the skin there, and she registered the cold and left the sleeve where it was. He walked beside her. He was in no particular hurry. He was, for the first time in a life built on the discipline of always knowing where the next thing was, and moving efficiently toward it, entirely present in the specific place and moment he was in, with no part of his attention already somewhere else. The horses waited at the edge of the terrace, with the uncomplicated patience of animals told to stand still, and standing still without elaboration. She reached them first. She checked the needles in her coat pocket. She knew they were there. She had known it all morning. But she checked them anyway, because 6 years of that specific habit did not dissolve in a single morning at a riverside table, and it was not the kind of habit she was in a hurry to dissolve. He did not say anything about the checking. She looked at the road east, clear and direct and going the right direction. Then she mounted, and he mounted beside her at the same moment, and they rode into the pale and honest winter light together. Behind them, the village of Harrow went back to being what it had always been, a small and quiet place at the edge of a gray river, watching things happen on its banks with the patient, uncurious attention of something that had been watching for a long time, and knew that things happened, and then things changed, and then things happened again. Ahead, the road stretched east, toward Valdenmoor, toward the decree that would be recanted, and the record that would be corrected, and whatever came after those things, which was neither of them's to predict, and both of them's to decide as it arrived. The crescent mark was visible on her wrist as they rode. The winter air was cold. She left the sleeve where it was. She concealed her true identity. The Alpha King realized too late she was his destined queen.